Nguyen Khac Giang, visiting fellow Vietnam Studies program at ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute. Well, thanks so much for joining us on East Asia Tonight, Giang. So let's just talk about this meeting in Beijing. Help us understand, right? They talked about this unshakable party bond. How can that coexist with the contentious conflict that they have in the South China Sea? And this bond, while unshakable as it is it possibly also unbreakable?
Well, I think it's very important to note that both countries are communists and they share the state ideology. So although they have a lot of disputes over the South China Sea, like Vietnam and the Philippines, Vietnam actually needs to have the support of China to maintain their regime survival. And also, more importantly, Vietnam has a lot of trade interests and economic interests with China. China is Vietnam's biggest trade partner. And so Vietnam is very dependent on China for their economic development. So that's why for Vietnam, it's important to maintain this strong bilateral relationship. And when To Lam chose China as the first foreign destination of his trip, I think it's signify To Lam's priorities in putting China as a priorities of his economic and foreign policy in the coming time.
But Za, we have to, we have to remind ourselves that Vietnam had their first joint drills with the Philippine Coast Guard earlier this month, right? And it seems to somewhat contradict with this narrative of an unshakable bond. But you did mention that they do share this communist state ideology, and that could perhaps, surpass the SCS tensions. But I mean, how do you interpret this move, though? The implications that this would have for China-Vietnam relations?
Well, I think we should put it into the context of Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy. So for Vietnam, it's important to note that why they still have some disputes with China, especially on the South China Sea. As they know that they have to limit the damage of the disputes in order to look into a bigger picture of economic and foreign policy cooperation. And also Vietnam and China, to some extent, they try to solve the problem bilaterally, and to some extent to reduce the damage of the tensions on the South China Sea. Although Vietnam and the Philippines are, I would say, the most vocal claimant states on the South China Sea dispute with China, Vietnam knows that if they cannot manage the relationship well, they cannot really counter China militarily on the South China Sea, and so they have to really maximize their foreign policy approach and try to play different strategies in order to convince China to take a different approach on the South China Sea, while at the same time maintain a good trade and economic relationship with China, as they are the most important economic player in Vietnam's economic strategy for the coming time.
Right. And since the president, To Lam, he's taken the reins in Vietnam, how would you say his foreign policy approach is? Does it deviate quite a fair bit from his predecessor, or you think it's more or less the same?
I think it's very hard to know because To Lam is a career policeman. He developed his career via the Ministry of Public Security. So we don't really know a lot about his ideas of foreign policy directions. But I think for the coming time, To Lam will maintain the bamboo diplomacy approach initiated by General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trọng before him, because first, To Lam wants to be seen as a rightful heir of Nguyen Phu Trọng because of a lot of political turbulence in the past few years under the anti-corruption campaign. So To Lam wants to be seen as someone who succeeds Nguyen Phu Trọng legitimately. So he wants to maintain that approach. And secondly, and I think more importantly, the bamboo diplomacy approach for Vietnam is actually working quite well, and there's no reason for To Lam to do that. So actually, if we look at the visit by To Lam now, although some people might think that it signifies Vietnam's, let's say, closer approachment with China, but at the same time, it may be preempt another, Vietnam and U.S. Further development in their bilateral relationship, because To Lam will come to New York next month, and then he would be, expected to meet American leaders there, and there might be some developments on that side as well. So
Yeah.
I think we have to put it into a very important context of bamboo diplomacy to understand the significance of this trip to China by To Lam.
Yeah, so this bamboo diplomacy that you've been talking about, but how do you think To Lam is going to be navigating this tightrope though between China and the U.S. and to what extent is it's going to be dependent on who becomes the next U.S. president?
Well, I think it's very important to note that for Vietnam, it's important to maintain the regime survival. So on that front, Vietnam needs China's support because they don't trust the West or America because they're always concerned about regime security. But Vietnam also needs U.S. and Western partners for national security, especially on the South China Sea dispute that you mentioned earlier. And I think this would be a very important test for Vietnam for the upcoming US election because if Trump, for example, becomes the next president, then there would be a lot of pressure on Vietnam Chinese ties because there are a lot of Chinese investment and trade via Vietnam and route to Vietnam to the US. And this problem of transshipment would be a big problem because Trump would likely punish Vietnam. He called out Vietnam as a single worst trade abuser a few years ago, and he's likely to pick up Vietnam as the next target of his trade punishment. If Harris becomes a president, then it would be likely easier for Vietnam to approach because Harris likely maintained the same approach by Biden, which is very, close to Vietnam, and they really lenient on Vietnam trade practices and as well as Vietnam human rights and democracy problems. For Vietnam, better to have Harris, but it's very hard to know for sure. And I think Vietnamese leaders know this really well and is preparing for many scenarios after the U.S. election later this year.
And I want to talk about the China-Vietnam cross-border rail project, which aims to boost economic ties. Can you just tell us what are some of the potential economic benefits and the strategic implications or the challenges as well of this rail project for both for Vietnam?
Well, just a very interesting fact is that the South China and the North Vietnam has a lot of potential for cooperation. So the Chinese province of Quảng Đông, for example, has a trade relationship with Vietnam, which have the volume of over 48 billion US dollars. So it's like triple Vietnam and Russia trade relationship. So it's a very, very important part of Vietnam to really have a good connection with the South China. And more importantly, Vietnam, if you look at around Southeast Asia, Vietnam is a country which has been quite hesitant to receive Belt Road Initiative projects by China. So I think the Chinese leaders in Beijing want Vietnam to more, receptive to BRI investments. And for the Vietnamese side, because of the growing economy, they really need more infrastructural investment. But they have been a little bit cautious of the intention of Chinese leaders for the Belt Road Initiative. So I think the trip by To Lam might signify a more open reception of Vietnam for big mega infrastructure projects invested by China. And I think the railway connection would be the first step for that.
And many thanks for your insights. Nguyen Khac Giang, visiting fellow Vietnam Studies program at ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute, speaking to us from Adelaide.